Olá, pessoal. Good morning. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us. We're going to start our webinar, Doing Business in Brazil. We're going to do this webinar today, which is pretty general on the main challenges and some opportunities in doing business in Brazil. And then we invite you to follow us. In the future, we're going to do some specific webinars and specific podcasts on special themes. So we invite you to follow us. You can send your email to us. That you're going to have our emails in the end of our presentation. You can send us your email so we can invite you for the next events we're going to do. That we're going to talk on specialized aspects of doing business in Brazil. So let's start. We're just waiting a little bit for other friends to join us. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. So sharing the screen with you. Our law firm is dedicated to corporate law. We are dedicated to foreign investment and business law with emphasis on oil and gas, energy, and infrastructure. We have been helping and supporting companies from the whole world to do business in Brazil. And we are specialized in corporate law, labor law, administrative law, conflict resolution, tax. We have a partnership with the law firm Murayama, Afonso Ferreira Brecht Piller, and they are our, let's say, our arm for taxation. So our agenda today is we're going to talk about to give you a general overview on Brazil. We're going to talk about how to set up a company in Brazil, the main options you have to set up a company in Brazil, how to partner with a Brazilian company or acquire a Brazilian business. We're also going to be talking about the procurement models in Brazil for oil and gas sector, and we'll give you some recent updates on the sector, on current and recent legislation that have been approved recently in the oil and gas sector. And in the end, we're going to talk about how Brazil is managing to reduce the red tape and bureaucracy in the government, agencies, and private sector. Okay, so let's start. Brazil is a huge country. It's the hugest country in Latin America. We are a democratic federative republic. Brazil is an emerging economy. Our GDP last year was 1.43 trillion US dollars. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, we had a contraction of over 4% of our GDP, and we are not yet under control. Our situation here in Brazil for the pandemic is not yet under control. We still have lots of deaths and lots of people getting ill. But the light in the end of the tunnel is that we have already vaccinated almost 10% of our population, at least for the first dose. And we are going to, and for the second dose, 6% is not a lot. So we are really hoping that the vaccine will will be going more fast in the next months. Brazil is a very innovative country. We are in the 5th place in the world, countries that dedicate to innovation and research and development. We have in Brazil, we are in the 3rd rank in the world in startup unicorns. So we have a lot of development in the startup and technology in Brazil. We are also going to become the 5th larger world producer of oil and gas in Brazil. We are developing a lot because of the pre-salt. We have this pre-salt oil and gas, which is the enormous reserves of oil and gas in Brazil. So we are very, let's say, happy and satisfied that we are already independent for our production, and then we're going to become the 5th largest producer in the world. Okay, so I'm going to invite Rita Zanforlin to talk about corporate, a little bit how to start your business in Brazil and what are the options that you have to structure a business in Brazil. So I'll invite Rita Zanforlin to talk now.
Thank you, Julia, and very happy to be here. Thank everybody that is today here with us, and also Bruno for also. It's a pleasure to share this webinar with you. Bruno will talk about the tax aspects later on. And what I want to cover first is this corporate issues about starting in Brazil. And we're gonna talk here some general aspects. Of course, this decision takes into consideration a lot of aspects of each particular business and interests, but this is going to give a good overview of some of the possibilities and some things that a foreign investor needs to take into account when deciding to start in Brazil. So we are talking about there are 2 options that we are touching on, is opening a Brazilian entity or partnership with an existing business in Brazil. So this is the first decision that has to be made, whether to be on your own, starting a new company, or partnering with someone that is already operating in Brazil. So the first, and then talking about partnering with someone that is already operating. There's some echo. Okay, so the first decision, whether to open a bank account, opening a company. There are 2. The first decision then is whether a subsidiary or a branch. And if you're going to the subsidiary, if you want to choose what type of corporate structure do you choose? So let's wait Julia to come back because I need her to pass on the slides for me. Julia, can you pass the slide? Next one. Thanks. So the branch. The branch is on one way you use your corporate structure that you have outside of Brazil, but there are a few things that has to be taken into account that you will require approval by the federal government. And since the branch is the same entity as the main parent abroad, there's no segregation of liability. And there are some requirements here in Brazil of publication of financial statements and other documents, corporate documents of both the parent company and the branch. However, it may be required for some for participating in some bidding process. For example, Petrobras requires for international bidding has been required at least, that companies, foreign companies have a branch here in Brazil to participate in the bidding. In relation then to opening a Brazilian entity, there are many types of corporate structures that are available. Speaking a little bit about the limited liability company and the corporation because they are the most used types of companies here in Brazil. And limited liability company, when starting a business in Brazil, is mainly what most investors choose because it's a more simple structure. And since 2019, it's also possible to have only one quota holder, which simplifies a lot, less documents to be produced abroad and sent to Brazil. And there is a easier, and the limit liability company also, there's a easier corporate governance. And usually when starting the small business, it's what most investors prefer. A corporation is also an option. It's usually adopted for more complex governance, and there's a board of directors with more than a minimum of 3 directors. But usually when there's an interest in trading the shares publicly. There are higher costs because this involves more publication, and so also this entails on more disclosure and all the regulations of public traded companies then has also to be observed, and corporate acts and so on. So it's a little bit more complex, but can be interested in some certain cases. Then a few procedures about opening a Brazilian entity, and what I think there are things that the foreign investor needs to be aware. The corporate documents of the foreign shareholder needs to be certified, apostilled at the origin, and then translated by an official translator here in Brazil. And this can be sometimes costly depending on the volume of those documents. The Brazilian company, needs to have an officer that is resident in Brazil. This officer can be, he or she can be a foreigner, provided that he or she has a resident visa to reside in Brazil. It's possible to obtain an officer visa for a foreigner to hold this position, and which requires at least 600,000 investment. Or also there is another option, or a lower investment of 150,000 when the company has a commitment to generate at least 10 employment positions within 10 years. The foreign shareholder needs to have a Brazilian resident that is a representative for all matters related to the ownership of the foreign entity. And this has to be something of trust that will be receiving summons and signing all the documents in Brazil on behalf of the foreign shareholder. The foreign shareholder will have to have a taxpayer registration number, it's a CNPJ. And no, there's no minimum capital required in general. And this is dependent on the size of the business and decision of the shareholders. And nowadays, the registration of the incorporation documents is really fast compared to some years ago. It would take months to open the company, the commercial register, the local junta comercial would take many weeks to open a company, and nowadays it's really, really fast. The company, the commercial register companies within a few days. And there are other registrations that are also integrated with the opening of the company in the commercial register, and then the company already has a municipal authorization, already has a tax authorization, tax registration number, I mean. So this is relatively fast and easy to do here in Brazil. Other licenses may be necessary, also depending on the nature of the business. For example, import-export license, and sometimes some professional bodies declare the engineer body that may be necessary depending on the activity, and all this needs to be reviewed in light of the specific activity that you plan to do in Brazil. Once you open the bank account, then next step usually is sending foreign capital to Brazil for the activities. And basically, there are two main ways to send capital to Brazil, which are through a intercompany loan, parent company loan, sending your foreign entity making a loan agreement with the Brazilian entity, or direct foreign investment in form of capital and shares, payment of shares and quotas. There is no necessity for approval, and there is no restriction on the origin of the capital here in Brazil, different from other countries and in the US, for example. There are no sanctions, so there's no restriction in relation to that, no approval necessary. The only thing is the registration. Brazilian Central Bank is very sophisticated and efficient, and registration is necessary also to allow then later on for payment of dividends to the parent company abroad, payment of interest, repayment of loans. Then what are the other option of then another aspect that I want to comment about or starting a business in Brazil is that whether it's of interest acquisition or buying a company that is already in Brazil, then the M&A considerations that we'll talk about later on. And also there can be also contractual arrangements, for example, a distribution agreement or a commercial representation agreement, which is partnership with an existing business in Brazil for selling goods mainly. And what is important to notice is that all these arrangements, either M&A operations or association agreements, they will need to pass through an antitrust consideration, and may be necessary to obtain prior approval of the CADE, which is the antitrust body here in Brazil. And it's very important that this is reviewed beforehand and before the closing of any operation, to avoid any fines by the antitrust authority. There are criteria to be checked. Associative agreements, for example, are subject if they are longer than 2 years. And for M&A transactions, you have to look at the annual revenues of the groups involved in the transaction. So contract arrangements, they can be really interesting in some cases, because there is very low investment necessary, since you just an agreement with a Brazilian distributor or commercial representative. But the backside of that is that you won't be able to benefit from Repetro, for example, and Bruno will talk a little bit about that, the tax benefits when you produce items in Brazil, or local content also, for example, there will be no local content, but in some cases can be interested for if the idea is only to sell foreign produced products here in Brazil, and low investment necessary. Then in relation to M&A options, we'll briefly comment on these three options, which is a share deal, an asset deal, or a joint venture or consortium. So in relation to the share deal compared with the asset deal, a share deal is a less complex transaction, since you only need to transfer shares, and everything that the company is all transferred, different from the asset deal that we will talk about a little longer. a little later. And what has to be in mind, that commercial contracts need to be checked for changing of control clauses that can trigger termination. And then seller, according to Brazilian law, seller is liable for pre-transfer debts for 2 years after withdrawal. However, we are talking here about liability of a shareholder, which according to Brazilian law is limited to cases of fraud, of breach of law, although we know that courts tend to be really flexible when we're talking about tax payments or more broad in relation to labor liability. But different from an asset deal, the liability, the remaining liability is for the shareholder, which is more limited. And of course, all this also is usually dealt through indemnities in the transaction documents. Then in relation to an asset deal, this is what in Brazil we call sale of a commercial establishment, which is not the sale of the shares, but all the assets that compose the business, which includes, for example, can include real estate transfer, which is taxable, and this has to be taken into account, sale of all machineries, all or cars, for example, whatever the business already has, the transfer of the employment agreements. Brazilian law allows the contracts to be transferred in case of a sale of a commercial establishment. The transfer of IP license and other license when applicable, and the assignment of each of the contracts. So since this includes each separate transfer of each of those assets, this is a more difficult implementation, more complex transaction. It requires the registration at the commercial register, the Board of Trade, the Junta Comercial, and publication at the official Gazette, the Diário Oficial, which then creditors can raise questions in relation to that and require prepayment of obligations. There are more risks of individual claims, either of employees when, for example, after the transfer activities are different from the activities under the other employer, and can raise claims in relation to that. And liability of the seller remains after 1 year after the transaction is published at the commercial register. And here, since we are talking about liability of the company itself and not the shareholder, it's a more broad liability. However, also this usually is dealt in the transaction documents as well. And then briefly about a consortium or a joint venture. It's the partnership with an existing company or a different company, also a foreign company from abroad. So partnership with different companies may be required for certain projects if you want to participate together, divide the risk of an operation, for example, in E&P projects where you are required to form a consortium if you want to have a partner. Usually there are specific partnership documents such as joint operation agreements, joint venture agreements, consortium agreements, and other types of documents. And if you're thinking about projects, for example, exploration and production, oil and gas projects, usually then there is a requirement of a Brazilian entity as a partner if you are dealing with public services and concession from authorities from the government. Possibility of a special purpose company and SPC to separate liabilities for the business itself from other business of the investor. That's a possibility. And I'm gonna pass back then to Julia now. She'll talk a little bit about the next topic, the procurement in oil and gas sector. Thank you.
Well, talking a little bit about the opportunities today in the Brazilian market for oil and gas, you have today more than 50 oil companies in Brazil, exploration and production companies. So all the majors are in Brazil. You have Shell, you have Sinopec, Repsol, Chevron, among others. So if your company already do business with these companies in other parts of the world, the system will be almost the same here in Brazil. You have private bids, and you have private contracts, and you negotiate the contracts, and that's it. Nothing different from elsewhere where you do business with these clients around the world. Other opportunities here exist with tier 1 suppliers. You have the drilling companies in Brazil and the first contractors with whom you can do business also, such as Baker Hughes, Halliburton, Aker, Modec, SBM. The drilling companies are all here, and you can do business directly with these companies also. The news is that Petrobras in the last years has decided, and it's been a political decision and a company decision, of course, trying to recover from the huge crisis of the oil price and the car wash, the Lava Jato operation. So Petrobras made a decision to divest in midstream and downstream sectors. So Petrobras today is really focused in upstream. And so the opportunity is that several companies, international companies around the world, are coming to Brazil to buy these assets, such as pipelines and refineries. So this is something that will also bring opportunities for suppliers from the whole world, because they can then supply to these private companies that will buy these assets from Petrobras. Petrobras is still the major procurement entity in Brazil for oil and gas, still buying maybe 80% of the whole products and services in Brazil for oil and gas. And how does it work? So how your company, and I'm not sure if you have already done business in Brazil, if you have already sold equipment to Petrobras or provided the service to Petrobras, but the major aspects of doing business of Petrobras are here. First, it's a public company. Petrobras is still a public company. So Petrobras is subject to a public bid process. So the bid process is very, let's say, has a number of steps. And this is something that we're going to do a special webinar just to talk about Petrobras bids in the future. So if you're interested, let us know. We're going to talk specifically about the bid process, but the bid process is public. The name says it. So the bid is public. So any company can participate to the bid process by going through the Petronet system, which is the website used by Petrobras to promote the bids. And then you have several steps that you have to follow and understand how it works. Petrobras does international bids to hire companies, foreign companies, directly. So sometimes, depending on the service, your company doesn't need to set up a company in Brazil. However, most of the services, considering they have technological aspects and they have technical aspects, it is required to have a branch in Brazil. So especially if you are going to provide service to Petrobras, you're going to need to set up a branch in Brazil. Now, Petrobras also runs private bids. Why? Because there is an exception to the public bids in the cases where Petrobras is part of a consortium. When Petrobras is part of a consortium of oil and gas companies, like with Shell and with Sinopec and with other oil and gas companies, and Petrobras is operating this consortium, then in this case, Petrobras can run private bids. So Petrobras today has two procurement models, the public one and the private one. How to know which one is public, which one is private? You check the bid notice, you check the bid notes, in the bid notice you have the information if it's a public or not. And if it's a private bid, the process is closed, so it's not transparent at all. So only the invited companies are aware of these bids. So these bids are restricted. So considering that most of the Petrobras is part of consortiums to operate most of the pre-salt blocks. So in the future, most of the procurement done by Petrobras will be private. So how does your company can participate to these private bids? You need to get into the Petrobras vendors list, and depending on the product or service, you need to pre-qualify. The pre-qualification is a process that your company is going to provide all the information about the technical aspects of your service or your equipment to Petrobras, and you get into the pre-qualified list. It means that after you are pre-qualified, you can participate to restricted bids. So it is very important to get into Petrobras vendors list as a company with your services and your products, and then to be pre-qualified under the pre-qualification process. And then you can participate to the restricted bids. So we're going to do a specific webinar about this subject in the future, if you're interested, because it's we're not going to be focusing too much on this matter today. Also, we're going to talk about Petrobras contract critical aspects. Petrobras has standard contracts. Most of the times, you participate to a bid, either a public or a private bid, you cannot change almost anything in Petrobras contracts because they are standard. If we talk about the liability clause, for instance, it's almost impossible to change the liability clause depending on your service. Most of the services, they are subject to a specific contract, standard contract, and there's no way you can change these clauses. Now, you can make some, before the bid, you can make some proposals to Petrobras to make some changes in the technical documents, in some terms and conditions, but most of the time you cannot change. Petrobras is not open to modification to the contracts. Now we're going to talk about some recent updates in oil and gas legislation and general corporate legislation. And I just wanted to tell you that if you have any questions about anything that we're discussing here, you can send through the comments, and we're going to respond to your question after we finished. After we finished here, we still have Bruno Afonso Ferreira will talk about taxation and repetro. Right after we finish here, Bruno will start about taxation and repetro, which is a specific regime for oil and gas. After that, we're going to open for questions. So you can write your question in the comments, and we're going to respond it, okay? This is another matter that we're going to do a specific webinar about, the new gas law. The new gas law has just been approved in April 8, 2021. This new gas law is being discussed for several years, almost a decade, because the idea is that the government and the industry have come to a consensus that Petrobras must not have the monopoly anymore in the transportation of gas in Brazil. So this gas law provides for a series of measures that have the same goal. The goal is to open the sector for private competition once and for all. So the idea is that any company from the whole world can come to Brazil and do gas transportation, and do treatment, and do LNG, to invest in LNG terminals. So the process is much more easy. The replacement of the concession regime by an authorization regime makes it much more easy for a company that wants to invest in the sector. The access is non-discriminatory to all the essential infrastructures, and there has been a total unbundling of the transport activity. So the idea is to finish with the concentration of the gas activities in Petrobras' hands. And this is really important for the country, because what the industry wants in Brazil is to have lower cost energy. So if we can have access to natural gas at a lower price, this is going to make a huge impact in the development of the country. We have another recent rule about decommissioning. One of the very important opportunities that you have in Brazil, if your company is specialized in decommissioning, or if you can provide any service or products for the decommissioning sector, we're going to have a huge investment in decommissioning in Brazil right now, because most of the fields, most of the platforms and rigs offshore, they need to go under this process. So we have a very detailed rule issued by the ANP, which is our regulatory agency for oil and gas. So we have a very detailed rule establishing the details of how this is going to work, and we already have, Petrobras has already issued some bids for decommissioning. And I can tell you, these bids are really huge. The values are enormous. It's very impressive. And we also have another very important change in Brazil, because now you have permanent offer of blocks. It means that any oil and gas company that wants to explore petroleum in Brazil, they can go to the website of the National Petroleum Agency and check our map of blocks, and they can present a request to our regulatory agency, ANP, that a bid is that this block is put into bid. So you can go and measure mostly for the onshore fields, and some of the sea also, some of the offshore fields too, excluding the pre-salt polygon. So you have the option to, you have the whole year, you have the possibility of make a proposal to the agency to prepare and to put in the market a bid for a field that you're interested in. And this is another matter that we're going to have a specific webinar about this in the future, okay? I'm now going to pass the word to Rita again. Thank you. She will talk about the upcoming oil and gas bidding rounds.
Thank you, Julia. So just comment very briefly on these two upcoming rounds from ANP, which is the oil and gas agency here in Brazil. And there will be the second bidding round for the product sharing agreements for the surplus volumes contracted under the transfer of rights regime to Petrobras in those two areas. These areas were not awarded in 2019, and now the government has changed some technical and commercial guidelines for these agreements. This will be product sharing agreements, and Brazil has these two possible regimes for oil and gas exploration and production: the concession regime and the product sharing agreement. And in this case, pre-salt areas are contracted under product sharing agreements. So very recently, a few days ago, April 2022, the government approved the technical and the commercial guidelines. There is yet not official date for this round to happen, but this is probably going to be announced anytime soon. And the 17th concession bidding round is anticipated for October this year. There will be 92 blocks in the areas of Santos, Campos, Potiguar, and Pelotas. Was already approved by ANP and awaiting approval by the TCU is the account check for the federal government entity, which also it's probably going to take a little longer than a month to be approved. The approval by ANP was also on April 22, like a few days ago. So these are new upcoming opportunities to investments in Brazil. And then finally, commenting briefly about recent efforts of the government to reduce bureaucracy in Brazil. This is mainly probably associated with the position of Brazil in the rank of the World Bank of countries to do business. And Brazil is in the position 124. And this shows the intention of the government to improve Brazil's position, to reduce the bureaucracy. In the past, Brazil has been known as a huge bureaucracy, and this has been, as I also commented before, this has been improving rapidly and very efficiently, showing the government the interest in facilitating new investments in Brazil. So this law 14,129 is very recent. It's from March, and it establishes this digital government policy, the Governo Digital, which is mainly aims for easy access to information, also worried about the protection of privacy of individual information, provides for digital services as much as possible. For example, digital signature being accepted in all branches of the federal government. So this aims to facilitate business in general. And the provisory measure is also very recent, of last month, also has covers many different issues, but one of them is the simplification of the process of setting up a company, creating easier steps within the commercial registers to make it even more faster and more reliable, with documents being available online and so on. So it's worth taking a look at that. And also I mentioned, I had a mention here about the limited liability companies, only one shareholder, which is recent. It's from 2019, but this has reduced a lot all the bureaucracy of opening companies in Brazil. Usually it was very common to see companies with 99% of one shareholder and 1% of another shareholder. And now this law, which is the economic freedom law, now allows companies to have only one quota holder, simplifying a lot the need to have two when there's actually one main and principal quota holder. So this is what we will cover, and again, as Julia mentioned, feel free to send questions to our chat or contact us. And I'm passing to Bruno, who will now speak about the tax implications.
I just want to mention very quickly here that Bruno is going to talk about very important matters on taxation, specifically for oil and gas, but also for the business in general. And Murayama Afonso Ferreira Brechbull is our firm, it's our partner for taxation. So I'm going to pass the word to Bruno, and I'm going to share his presentation right now.
So good morning, everyone. While Julia loads the presentation, well, she made a brief description about us. We are a law firm, Brechbull, Murayama Afonso Ferreira. All of us have around 20 years experience in taxation, litigation, consulting, planning, national, international. We have very heavy practice in oil and gas, energy, mining, and services in general. So this is a doing business in Brazil, meaning we don't go very deep into any of the matters we discuss, but rather present you an overview of the main items you should consider when setting up or running business in Brazil. This is targeted more for non-residents, but we've seen the attendee list and a portion of you is Brazilian. So maybe you're already familiar with what we're going to say here, or at least part of it. But still, we hope to be able to present you useful information. So basically, in 15 minutes, which is very short, we're going to briefly talk about the taxes we have in Brazil, the main ones, the most important items you need to focus at when setting up a business in Brazil. We're going to go over Repetro and its benefits, which are really, really important for the oil and gas industry, and talk about tax efficiency and planning in general. So, Julia, please, moving on. Very, very quick overview. We have federal taxes, we have state taxes, we have municipal taxes. Our constitution and national tax code sets up these powers. So most of the taxes we have are federal. These are the most important ones here. The corporate taxes, which are the RRPJ, corporate income tax, 15% rate with a surtax of 10% of amounts exceeding 20K a month. We have a social contribution on profits, which has a 9% rate. These two combined are called the corporate taxes, and usually we calculate them at a 34 approximated rate. We have PIS and COFINS, which are federal contributions charged over gross income. These can be very burdensome if you don't plan yourself right. As you can see, you have a 9.25 combined rate for most companies, which are allowed to use credits to offset these taxes. So this is an important analysis to be made all the time. And there is another regime which has a lower taxation, but a cascade one. But for companies that have revenues up to 72 million a year. So, and also exports are immune from these taxes. As general comments, these taxes are also charged on imports. You can move, Julia, please. Also on imports, with a higher rate for goods, 11.75%. So these are important taxes and not affected by treaties. So we need to deal with these. We also have IPI, which is a tax on manufactured products. It's a value-added tax, as most of you are familiar. So you take credit for the purchase you make, and you pay this tax over your markup in most cases. In exports are immune from this tax as well. We also have the import duty, import tax charged over the customs values of goods, depending on the NASH classification, which is an international standard. We have ex-tariffs, which are applicable when we don't have national production of these items. We can apply for an ex-tariff and try to reduce the burden of this tax. We have a tax on financial operations, the IOF, hardly ever mentioned in doing business guides, but this is important one is an important tax as it is charged on most international remittances for the inflow and outflow of funds. So it's important to consider this. We have cases in which we have a 6% tax. So no one wants a 6% ticket when sending money in. So this is also important. And then we go to the state and municipal taxes. State, we have the ICMS, which represents a very big portion of the general tax collection in Brazil. It's charged over the sale and import of goods, also on some services, transportation, but very specific ones. And there is a gross-up system, meaning that the rate is charged itself inside of the base. So this is a very burdensome tax. It can be as low as 4% from some situations and 25%. It depends on the items involved or services. On the states involved, as we have different taxation when richer countries, richer states sell to poorer states, or the opposite. Exports are immune to the ICMS as well. We have the ISS, which is the last one we're talking about. For municipal, cities can charge it between 2 and 5%. Depending on the service, there are codes and specific rates for services, and the municipalities involved, as they have capacity to fix their rate among these thresholds. Then you can't read this, but this presentation can be made available in the end. I can email it to you, whoever wants it. It's a table we made with the main taxes and a brief description of basis of calculation and the rate. So we can pass this because I don't think it's readable. And then, okay, more important than the taxes description, the main comments we want to make here is that these topics are really, really important based off of our experience when assisting foreign clients. Brazil, for instance, Brazil adopts a source approach, meaning all payments we make here from Brazilian source to a foreign source are subject to withholding income tax. We have treaties to avoid double taxation, which I'm going to talk about them in a second, but we do, as a general rule, have source approach here. A few exceptions, for instance, charter hire has a 0% withholding tax rate. Dividends are not subject to taxation when remitted, but this is really important for intercompany transactions. We do have double taxation avoidance treaties, which have been disrespected by Brazilian federal tax authorities for some years, to the point that Germany canceled the treaty they had with us. Finland threatened to cancel this treaty as well, until Brazil, we need to obey these treaties now. So the jurisprudence is getting better to taxpayer side. Since many transactions shouldn't be subject to taxation, they are. We also have blacklisted jurisdictions. The IRS, Federal Revenue Office, from time to time issues a list of jurisdictions that are treated as tax havens, the blacklist one, which has aggravated taxation. So we have a general 15% withholding tax rate, aggravated to 25% when doing transactions with these companies. So it's really important when coming to Brazil to analyze the corporate structure you have abroad, so you don't hurt yourself. And then we go to the next one. Also, important items to discuss: transfer pricing, similar arm's length, similar to what you have abroad, except that in Brazil we have different methods set up by the law, and the companies are allowed to choose the cheapest one. This is clear. So this is a compliance and also with a tax consequences, because depending on transfer pricing adjustments you have to make, you may pay extra taxes in Brazil. So this is really important to look at, especially considering the IRS has specific transfer pricing teams now. We have thin capitalization rules. Well, for those of you who don't know, when you fund a Brazilian company, you can fund it through capital, you can fund it through a loan. By funding it through a loan, you allow interest to be paid, and this interest is tax deductible. So these rules set up the limits of how much you can deduct. We do have this in the US and in other countries as well. So important to know we do have these as well here. We have many incentives to exports. As I mentioned before, they don't pay a lot of taxes, so some businesses that are export-oriented tend to do good in Brazil. We have so many special tax regimes. As you've seen, the rates of the taxes here are very high, so the government decide which industries they want to incentivize, and they create regimes for these industries. We have so many of them here. Also, some of them are based on region. For instance, Northeast and North of Brazil have beneficial regimes as well. We have a very strong tax compliance. This is SAMIS. This represents a big cost for companies. I read it somewhere that Brazil is the most costly country when it comes to tax compliance. And also tax disputes. All of these taxes I mentioned, we have a menu of discussion of disputes for these taxes regarding items. So it's really important when stepping in Brazil to get to know how you're going to fund your company, what kind of clients you're going to have, how you're going to structure yourself to build your clients, what kind of tax credits you're going to have from your operations. This can be the difference between winning or losing a bid or making a successful business in Brazil or not. Doing the taxes right won't guarantee you success, but if you do it wrong, you have very big chances of failing. Just as a quick example how it works here, we put a slide about a regular import. So we have a foreign supplier selling out goods to a Brazilian company. These are the taxes you pay. You see the burden is high. Some of these taxes are recoverable, but still, if you look at a nominal rate, we have a very big one, adding up all these taxes. Julia, you can jump. And then if you import a service, it's also expensive in Brazil. On top of the withholding income tax, which can be of 15 or 25% rate, depending on the type of services, with a few exceptions to zero, you have a 10% federal contribution, you have the PS and COFINS and the ISS. Some of these you can recover, but still important burden. And then if you do business inside Brazil, if you sell to a local client or if you render service to a local client, you sell, you pay the ICMS, you pay the PS and COFINS, you pay the IPI, as I mentioned before. If you render services, you pay the ISS and PIS and COFINS as well. On top of all these, you pay the combined corporate taxes. So, lots of taxes. Planning yourself is really important. Now, Julia. Now, talking specifically about Repetro, which is a main incentive for Brazilian oil and gas industry, on top of 0% withholding tax on charter hire payments. Repetro was created in the 90s, originally for the temporary import of goods, and then it was expanded. Other operations are also allowed, as we'll see below. Brazilian Federal Revenue Office is responsible for regulation and management, including making a list of the items that can benefit from the regime, which is something we should check beforehand for all potential deals. Repetro allows temporary admission of goods with a full suspension of federal taxes. Also allows, as of the new Repetro, the purchase, imports or local, of certain goods for the operation of the main asset, spare parts, consumables, also with a full exemption of federal taxes. Of course, you need to keep this item. You're not allowed to import with the exemption of taxes and then sell it. But as long as you keep it, you keep the benefit. And also we have a third regime, which is the Repetro for industrialization. Julian, please. Which is a new one. It allows a company to import or purchase local items in Brazil, manufacture something with these items, and sell it to a oil and gas beneficiary, Repetro beneficiary. You don't pay any of the taxes over the import or local purchase, rather than only your corporate taxes. Except to all of these, which is the ICMS, which is a state tax. The states didn't decide to fully adhere to the 0% regime, but instead created a 3% rate specifically for that. In Rio, we also have an additional 1% rate being challenged at court, since the state is in deep trouble in its finances and then decided to make this. So still, we're going to see in the next slide a comparison. We can move, Julian. We saw regular import before in the previous slide, how high it can be. If you use Repetro, this is how much you pay. So you see a significant reduction in all of these taxes. Also, on the next one, Repetro for industrialization, we just mentioned. So these are the taxes you pay. This can be very, some can say we are similar to a tax haven when doing this, but we're not. We still have the 34% corporate taxes, but your cash flow is so much improved with zero, as you remove your costs from purchases. And then, well, that's basically it. So it's an overview. Here we have my email information. So if you want to have a private question and not a public one, feel free to send me an email. I'll be happy to answer you. So now we open for your general questions. Thank you all.
Okay, Bruno, thank you for the presentation. We're gonna share with you our emails through the comments, And we invite you to send any questions that you have through our emails. I'd like to thank you for your participation, and hope to see you in the next events. We're going to be preparing for you on specific matters, one at a time, because this is a lot of information in 1 hour. So we'd like to do some specific events for specific matters. So it's going to be maybe a little more easy to digest. Rita and Bruno, have some comments? Any comments?
Yeah.
Fine. Just thank you all for being here.
Yeah, I want to also thank you, Julia and Bruno, for sharing this event. And thank you for everybody that was here with us. And very happy to answer questions if you have later on. Just feel free to reach us.
I'm going to share here also our email.
There's a question here. Yes.
Definitely does. For imports, for purchases, yes. Generally speaking, of course, we need to check specifically what is intended to be done, but as a general guideline, yes, it does.
Yeah, Bruno, is it right that the Petro regime applies to all operation of oil and gas, hydrocarbons and gas, right? Not only oil.
Yeah, most of them. I don't like to say to all operations because there are always exceptions, but to most operations. And if you want to purchase an item, lease an item, purchase from a local or international supplier, all these are incentivized to reduce capex and initial costs.
Great.
Any additional question? No? So we're going to finish our event now. We thank you very much for your participation. Hope to meet you in the future for next talks. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Isa, for your help and support.
You have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.